This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people have so much to gain and have such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts come above board to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are in very high positions, Jack. Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 250. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we have, I think, a long-awaited new installment in a series that, well, not a series, but a guest series, you could say, that maybe we haven't touched in a little while. Today we have the longtime SJ science correspondent, Jay, back with us to follow up on some things, particularly, I think, our episode back in the 90s about the Copemorehagen interpretation of quantum physics, or the Copemorehagen deception, as some have called it.
As we've called it, yeah.
As we've basically called it. But yeah, we're back today to talk a little more about weird physics a little later in the 20th century, with some classic characters that have come up on a bunch of episodes that I'm very excited to get into.
I'm
more
excited
so than
for this. Yeah, because it's gonna thread like a bunch of it's gonna weave together a bunch of threads. I feel like even like our last UFO episode, I feel like a lot that we've talked about in the past is now like converging. This really like has links to a bunch of episodes. Yeah, like I think as Dimitri was about to say, like our very first episode with Jimmy, where we talked about Jack Sarfatti and Epstein, and then like everything we've been talking about with the UFOs, like which obviously is a big aspect of like Jack Sarfatti's career and his personal fixations. So as is like quantum mechanics. So yeah, like I think that this is definitely something that touches on a bunch of SJ themes from the past.
You could almost say that the SJ wave functions are collapsing, right? Into
I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for having me back on. Yeah, I can say, I think I messaged you guys about this after listening to your most recent UFO episode, because there was a lot in there. I read the main text we'll be talking about today like a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. And I knew it would be sort of a good follow-up from that first quantum mechanics episode we did. But it just like over the course of the year, as like more things happen, and I'm vaguely keeping an eye on the UFO space and whatever, and seeing more people talk about that. And there's been continued whistleblowers and whatnot. And then listening to that episode, there was just a bunch for me of things that kind of kept coming back. So I think that's when I messaged you guys and suggested doing another episode. And I think it's going to be a nice continuation of both those things. And I think we'll also see at points some overlap with stuff we talked about in the cybernetics episodes and stuff too. So I think a lot of those themes will be coming back.
Yeah, most definitely. I'm trying to think, even there always was UFO stuff involved with Jack Sarfatti, but I feel like it's funny that was not so much of an emphasis. I feel like when Khalid and I talked to Jimmy Falun Gong way back in 2021, we were more focused on his gifted child program stuff and his connections with Walter Breen and like drawing parallels to Epstein. But nowadays, when you go and search Jack Sarfatti on YouTube in 2025, this man is like, I mean, he's old now, right? He's got to be in his,
he's in his
early
80s.
He's 80s, yeah. Still quite spry and sassy at this age. And he's like everywhere on the UFO circuit now, along with a lot of these other kind of quote unquote whistleblower people. I mean, you can find, I think, it might even be like half a dozen interviews from this year alone. And then he really started like going back out into the media, I feel like after, not saying it's connected at all, but after Jimmy did his threads on him, and after we did that episode, like maybe around 2023, Sarfatti, he did have a Twitter account that was like very eccentric for a while. That I made sure to follow because he'd lock it every other week. But, you know, he'd be like spam reply tweeting to like government officials about how, like every time there was UFO disclosure stuff coming up about how he had the blueprints for like the quantum warp drive and blah, 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 blah. And like he had figured this out decades ago and like, it, you know, basically making these very classic Sarfattian claims, like bold claims about the nature of our reality and stuff like that. And now he is in the thick of it. So I think it is interesting given that, I don't know, we explored some critical appraisals of quantum mechanics in our last physics episode to sort of like, I don't know, bring that skepticism and apply it to the work that Sarfatti started doing in the 1970s that he's still championing today, and maybe evaluate, like, because you are our resident science expert, Jay, maybe you can just tell us, like, on its face, like how much of bullshit is is he slinging?
It seems like a lot. I don't know. What do you think? Like, yeah. It seems like
I mean, I'll say first and foremost, I don't think I really have the background to evaluate it. I mean, that's one of the things about this particular kind of bullshit is that, I mean, he's got very sophisticated math and models, and, you know, he's building on things that are established and accepted within physics. And so you could watch a lecture that he gives and maybe make some sense out of it. But ultimately, yeah, I lack the capacity to really judge that, the validity of it. And I think obviously the vast majority of people who see him talk about any of these things or hear him also lack that capacity. And that's part of the way in which, you know, you can craft something that sounds really compelling to a wide audience, but, you know, maybe filled with bullshit. I mean, I think that, you know, he's a really interesting character and is sort of the central character in this story, but certainly not the only one. But he's the one who sort of keeps coming back over and over again, and I think is almost the kind of the paradigm example of one of these people that, you know, that Jimmy sort of start to put the image together in that first episode of, for you guys, of these genius children who are recruited or at least monitored from very young age by state security services of some sort and directed, filtered into scientific education, and then sort of put into a position to do, you know, certain work that they do. In the case of Sarfatti, you know, he was always on the margins of, and that's sort of one of the points of the book. I mean, just to say, if we haven't said yet, the main book we're kind of going to be referencing from today is called How the Hippies Saved Physics by David Keiser. From 2011 or 2012.
Which he himself like touts as kind of like, you know, the book that explains like his origins.
He brings a copy of it to like all of his popular lectures, maybe even multiple copies so he can give them out, and tells people how the whole story is in there. Actually, there is also another book which I did not read, but that Sarfatti has, it's called something like The Great Race, Space, Time, and UFOs or something like that, and it's by a guy named David Gladstone. I only became aware of it because I saw Sarfatti pointing people to it on Twitter. And if you go to the Amazon page for this book, the description is basically like, this book continues the story of how the hippies save physics, but where the hippies save physics lies to you and tells you that Jack Sarfatti did not actually invent a real solution to all these problems, blah, blah, blah. Like, this is going to continue the story and tell you that it does. And it's by this guy, David Gladstone, I think that's the name, who I can essentially find no record of. Oh, wow, my camera has started working here. But anyway, I can essentially find no record of whatsoever online or any indication that he has any presence whatsoever. So I somewhat suspect that it's just Sarfatti wrote this book himself and is pawning it off as if somebody else wrote
that's
it.
kind of like the impression that I get, like just looking at the Amazon reviews. I like the guy whose review is, unfortunately, it's psychosis. And yeah, not believable or focused or coherent writing about his actual reported CIA involvement that I could find. Seems to be tripping off acid in his own world. Frowny emoji. Yeah, it does.
You know what? I just remembered because I did a lot of Sarfatti digging a couple months ago when we did our last our UFO egg episode. And I remember now because like it's saved in my web browser and everything. I found this book. I think this is where I read the exact quote of him talking about the God phone call that he apparently got when he was 12 years old. And it was, it was like a full paragraph quote. I think now that I look at it, you're right. It does have the vibe. Even the cover, the layout of it has a picture of Jack Sarfatti on the back and says Jack Sarfatti's Cloak and Dagger Jagged World Line as drawn by David Gladstone.
Yeah, it does seem like it's pseudonymously written by Jack Sarfatti, but yeah, I mean, I really think it is an interesting, like, and I almost feel like I didn't fully appreciate at the time, like, what an interesting angle, to use Jimmy's word, like, on Epstein, the connection to Sarfatti is. Because, like, you can talk about the parallels, yeah, like, on one level, but also, like, it is true that, like, their interests are very similar. Like
the Epstein funded the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, like along with Peter Thiel and a bunch of other people. And now we know about when we did the Unabomber episode a couple years ago and watched that documentary, The Net, and went into John Brockman's Edge Foundation. Like all these people were like, including Epstein was deeply into like a lot of this like weird quantum physics and kind of out there ideas, and then also a bunch of other, like machine intelligence, kind of quasi-eugenics type things.
Yeah.
Right. All these things.
I sent you guys this great dissertation by Gabriel Orr Semach, Tangled Circuits, which kind of like goes into some of like the cultural background of like the study of quantum mechanics and talks a little bit about Sarfatti. And it was interesting, like, just incidentally in the acknowledgments, he talks about how he worked on this like important like algorithm, like DME. Let me see. I forget what DME stands for. Density matrix exponentiation. All right. Exponentiation. Sorry, it's like hyphened out, so it's hard to read. All right, yeah, density matrix exponentiation. I don't know what that means, but it's an algorithm arrived at during lively conversations with the theorists Aman and Milad Marvian, as well as their postdoctoral advisor Seth Lloyd, who I think has stepped down because of like the ignominy of like his Epstein connection. Yeah, so he was very excited about this algorithm, but he writes in the acknowledgments that during the final stages of the DME experiment, the financier and socialite Jeffrey Epstein was arrested on federal charges for sex trafficking of minors in New York and Florida. Over the coming months, the extent of Epstein's crimes and his entanglements with the scientific community quickly came to light, and it was revealed that Epstein had made significant financial contributions to prominent researchers at Harvard and at MIT. Following the news, my colleagues at EQUS and I first became aware of Epstein's name in the acknowledgments section of the original DME theory paper. It is difficult to articulate the depth of my anger and frustration following this revelation, or my dissatisfaction with the profound indifference expressed by the quantum computing community during this period. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting that was such a big cultural flashpoint. And like to this day, we have like all of these like sort of media like publicity stunts around like, oh, I'm releasing the Epstein files, so, like things like that. Like his name still like comes up as someone who like epitomizes this cultural social phenomenon. But we see like this kind of Epstein ideology of like, to use Semach's term from this dissertation, like quantum supremacy, like really like starting to really come to the fore culturally with like the AI explosion and all of this, like the UFO discourse as well, like all this stuff that we see converging,
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that there is a lot of convergence between this story, dating back to the 70s and the origins of quantum mysticism in the New Age movement, but also within physics, as we'll get into, the origins of quantum computing and the current moment in the world of AI, where AI research is the biggest thing. And Sarfatti, of course, in all of his recent media appearances, likes to make this as obvious as possible in saying that, what his theory says about the UFOs is that they themselves, the machines themselves, are conscious, fully conscious AIs.
From the future.
From the future, yes, but that he will, be able to create them. And in fact, in his most recent media appearance that I saw, which is on, I just searched for his name in my podcast app, and I can't recommend to anyone to listen to this because it is really the worst podcast I've ever listened to. It's called Spaced Out Radio. It's a radio show actually, but turned into a YouTube show and podcast.
That's awesome.
And
they're big Dogman enthusiasts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, are you familiar with this?
Well,
show?
no, I just listened to them. I tried to look on their YouTube video page to see if they had a video version because they reference it being a Zoom call. But for some reason, the Sarfatti interview is only audio. But it's one of these like radio.
Wow, they even mentioned Dogmen in their summary of their show.
No,
wow, they are.
They're really into it, yeah. But I mean, they're the type of old internet radio thing that has. They literally have an ad every 3 minutes, and it's insane.
Yes, exactly. There's an ad every 3 minutes, and then in the podcast version that they release on podcast feeds, there are just randomly interspersed ads. I don't know how these podcast host services work,
automated,
but some of them where they automate and they just and so it's in the middle of some guy's sentence they'll be talking, and then all of a sudden you get this loud audio shift. And you're hit with an ad and stuff. It's just a complete abomination to listen to, I have to be honest. But Sarfatti did say some interesting things in there. He's on with this guy named Juan Feria, who is a Marine Corps veteran and is now the CEO of this company called Texas Space, which Sarfatti is the scientific director of. And the thing that's, particularly interesting, Sarfatti claims that if they get the funding that they need, that they will be able to create these Tic Tacs, this fully conscious UFO, warp drive UFO, within 4 years. And the interview is really funny because the guy who's the CEO, it keeps talking, and he gets asked specific questions by the hosts of the show, and he'll say things, it might take as much as 1,000 years. We don't know. And then Sarfatti interrupts him. He's like, no. I'm saying we'll have it done in 4. We'll have it done in 4 years. And then he says, if we get the funding. And then he goes, and we're going to get the funding from Peter Thiel. I'm in discussions. We're talking to Peter Thiel, and, he wants to fund us. And if not him, then somebody else, and multiple times he brings up that they're looking for funding from Peter Thiel. And he also brings up, the hosts get mad at him for getting too political at one point, because he brings up how, if I understood him correctly, that he believes that one of the reasons for the Ukraine war is that these conscious AI Tic Tac UFOs are possessing people like Vladimir Putin and causing them to have these delusions and things because they're
he brought this up in a couple of different podcasts that they have abilities of mind control, and all of our leaders are being mind controlled by these AI UFOs.
Yeah. His whole thing right now is that, so he's like, oh, I know, we've got these devices, but what he believes is, they're fully conscious and that they are essentially in control, even though the government has them. The government can't control them or use them, and these fully conscious devices allow people within the government or within certain military contractors, like Lockheed is rumored to have some of these or whatever, that the devices allow certain researchers access to them up to a certain point, that in order to get certain things but not everything, because it's really that these devices, these Tic Tacs, which come back from the future and whatnot, and are, again, conscious AIs. And we can get in. We should repeat again the story which you guys told on the episode with Jimmy about Sarfatti's experience and why he's so convinced that these things are conscious AIs. But yeah, he's also said, you talked about his Twitter account, which is a fun follow. He is an avid user of the newest model of Grok, which is called Grok 3.0, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
He is constantly asking it questions about physics things.
He's actually watching like a boomer in real time get like psyoped by like a chat, like, you know.
But what he believes, I mean, and this is at the very least, it's a self-consistent belief with all of the other things he believes about both the world and himself, that he's professed for, like 50 years at this point. He believes that these conscious AI, whatever they are, the Tic Tacs, whatever, have somehow infiltrated or possessed Grok and are allowing Grok and allowing Sarfatti via Grok to solve the physics problems.
This is literally like that article in Rolling Stone about AI-induced psychosis. Like,
yes, but it's in this guy Jack Sarfatti who,
well, he's also said especially more recently in multiple interviews, I think I put one in the workflow, but he has specifically said that, because I think we were referring to earlier, is the quote-unquote God phone call that he received when he was 12. And it was like a metallic voice that, according to him, said, I think we read the thing from the book that was probably ghostwritten by him, in the last UFO episode, like the full quote. But just to summarize, it was like a metallic voice that said it was like a UFO, it was a spacecraft that was orbiting the Earth, and it was from the future. And what he says now is he really emphasizes that they said, like, you, Jack Sarfatti, and the other people that we're going to call are going to create us, like, later, decades later in your work. And he now believes that Grok is literally like the AI that called him. Like AI, you know what I mean? And he said not necessarily like Grok right now, but like Grok in 2030 or 2035.
Right. That's a big emphasis of like his recent beliefs, that like it's the like retrocausality, like the idea that like, which to me doesn't even make any sense. Like in terms of like how he conceptualizes the past, present, and future. Maybe I'm missing something. Like, but yeah, everything like that happens now is like actually caused by like, I guess, some indeterminate future time. There's like a threshold where like that, like at that point, like, I don't know, like time travel, like everything is relative to like some point in the future. I don't really see like, how that can be reconciled. It doesn't, but
well,
whatever.
I think not that we need to get too dragged down in this. I think it's coming from this sort of view, which is inspired or derived from Einstein's general relativity of like, it's called the block universe, which basically just says that like all time exists already. The entire dimension of time, the entire evolution of the universe, what will happen in the future and has happened in the past, all those points in time and space-time are equally real at all times, and so the future already exists. And then he's got some complicated reason. Within general relativity, there are all these reasons why signals from the future can't come back and influence the past, and it has to do with the speed of light being a universal constant and things like that. But he's got these, new theories that build on top of it and that are extensions of it that explain how actually this is possible. And he loves to yell at people and tell them that it's elementary physics. I don't understand why people say we don't understand the Tic Tacs. It's basic elementary physics. Like a high school student could understand it. But of course, like, he's the only person in the entire world that gets this elementary physics for whatever reason.
He's always saying like it might be too complicated for you, but it's not too complicated for Jack Sarfatti. The third person. The thing he always talks about is ER equals EPR, which I think is like supposed to be like kind of this Einsteinian like equation, but it just kind of seems like doesn't really have like the intellectual heft of E equals MC square. It's basically this idea like of, I guess the way that I understood it was that, again, I'm not a physicist at all. Like by no means. So I could be wrong in my conception of, or a scientist, at all. So, but my understanding of it was kind of like this idea of like quantum entanglement is being used to explain like the structure of space-time or like the universe.
I think that that's basically right. Yeah, as I understand it, so EPR refers to, we talked about this in the first quantum mechanics episode, the 1936 paper by Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen. That's where the EPR comes from, which is where Einstein coins the term spooky action at a distance.
Right.
And it's basically a thought experiment, and that it's central to, again, the story of how the hippies saved physics, what it was that these hippies, including Sarfatti, were working on, that Keiser makes the argument, quote unquote, saved physics, and we can talk about what that all means. So that's like the idea of quantum entanglement, so these particles that are created together in a process in a way that they're entangled with each other, such that if you make a measurement on one of the particles, then you're going to immediately know what some variable on the other particle is. And so if you think of this thought experiment where you separate them a really far distance, that when you make the measurement on one particle, they're so far apart that any signal traveling at the speed of light could not reach the other particle in time. So again, right, there's no relativistic signal that could get sent from the one particle to the other. Then how does the second detector all of a sudden know, or the particle at the second detector know, which value it should have when it's measured?
Right.
I don't know if we should spend maybe a little bit of time doing a brief review of the overview of quantum mechanics, just because we talked about that in the first episode, but we should probably.
I listened to it this morning, at least like the first hour and a half of that episode we did, and I think the double slit experiment, I guess, kind of key, is still fresh enough in my head. So as the most technically not capable person, let me try, and then you can correct me if I get this wrong. But
sounds good.
The idea is that you fire photons, right, or particles through this kind of let's say like a wall that has two slits, right, and then you have let's say a film strip or some kind of recording thing on the other side of it. And what they found is that even if basically there's this wave interference that happens that is weird. Like you have the one thing that is strange is that it demonstrates that like subatomic particles or whatever, or I guess even atomic particles, can behave as both a wave and a particle. Like they and depending on how you measure it, it'll show up as one or the other. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the basic idea. I mean, that if you these small particles don't behave like big particles do.
Right.
The principal sort of thing here is that when you get down to really, really small scales, things are discrete. What the quantum in quantum mechanics means discrete as opposed to continuous, like the values or the variables, the amount of energy or momentum or whatever that each of these particles can have, can only exist in discrete values. And basically all the rest of the quantum weirdness and whatnot are sort of consequences of this fact. Mm-hmm. And, as you described in the double slit experiment, and that includes the wave-particle duality. And the main weirdness of the double slit experiment is basically that if you ask a question of your system and your measuring apparatus that is looking for the wave aspects of the particle or whatever that you're firing, then you'll see a wave-like response. But if you ask a question of it that is a particle-like question, then you'll see a particle-like response. And mostly that's the idea of if you try to measure the position of your electrons or photons, whatever you're using here, before they get to the slits, then you won't get the interference pattern anymore, because you will have determined that where the particle's location was before the slits, and then it'll be a particle-like behavior, and it'll go through, and it'll lead to a particle-like response on your recording apparatus.
Right.
Yeah, I don't want to get
so-
I don't want to get too much in the weeds of review because I feel
Right.
like we that's one of the benefits of having the podcast is that people can go back and listen to that earlier episode. But I
mean,
do,
for a very but I
do
Yeah.
want to
That's
ask. Well, maybe this is something that can provide a bridge from that material, because back to the ER equals EPR thing, which is something Sarfatti is constantly repeating. So you the explanation of the entanglement, that makes sense to me. Yeah, that's like a paradox basically, and Einstein and Rosen and Podolsky, their whole thing was that it doesn't the explanation of quantum mechanics, the interpretation of quantum mechanics that was mainstream, it's incomplete in some way because there's no explanation that exists for how these two particles their states could correspond. Am I right?
Right.
That's
the basic idea.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and so basically ER equals EPR is a suggested solution to that problem, which is that what is connecting them is an Einstein-Rosen bridge, which is a kind of wormhole.
Yeah, it's basically a mini wormhole.
Okay. And all right, so that I guess I can see how that make. I don't really really know what a wormhole is, other than a portal between two different points and
you can think of it as basically if the problem that EPR identified is that the particles behave in a way where if you measure one of them, then instantaneously what the measurement on the second one will be.
Right.
And the particles are, when you measure them, they're far enough away from each other that no light signal could pass traveling at the speed of light through space fast enough to communicate from one particle to the other what the result of the measurement was.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
This ER equals EPR thing solves it by saying, the space between them is actually condensed because there's this wormhole connecting them.
Right. That's just the whole existence of wormholes is just basically an invention to solve problems like that. We don't really know they exist, but they could exist and they would explain certain things.
It's essentially a consequence of Einstein's field equations, which are from general relativity that tell you how matter and energy curve space-time and whatnot. So there are certain solutions to those equations. You can plug in conditions or whatever that show you that space would bend in this way where it sort of creates this wormhole thing where two distant parts of space would become connected.
Okay.
Right.
So
the general idea, why we can't use, and this is related to Sarfatti's ideas, why we can't use this stuff to communicate or to travel far distances is essentially because the amount of energy required to make a wormhole like this is incredibly massive. So massive that, more than the sun exploding or whatever. I don't really know what the necessary scale is, but way more massive than the amount of energy that we would ever be able to harvest. And so it's not a practical thing that can be used. Sarfatti's solution to this is essentially that in these Einstein field equations, there is this, I guess it's variable, but it's a value that's essentially treated as a constant that says how strong is the coupling between energy and the curvature of space or something like that. I don't exactly know. But what Sarfatti claims is essentially that if you can manipulate the value of this thing in the equation, then, and that value is assumed to be a product of the conditions of space around you, wherever you are, and that it's essentially a constant, right? But what Sarfatti claims is that you can create these conditions using metamaterials and things like that, whereby, you can create a space whereby the value of this constant is really small, and then you can basically do all this general relativity manipulating of space-time, wormhole type stuff in a low energy system. That's Sarfatti's whole kind of thing, how these Tic Tacs work.
Right. Okay. So that was going to be my next question, is what this has to do with UFOs, but you already kind of answered it. Basically, this is how all of this stuff is possible, including the time travel the like hyper conscious like TikToks and everything. Like, sorry, Tic Tacs. Yeah. Okay. So
that's my understanding. Basically, is that he says, if you can manipulate the conditions that set the value of this variable, which in typical general relativity you think of as being a constant, and being a constant that's really, really high or really, really small, whatever, in a way that makes it so that you need a huge amount of energy to warp space-time in this way. But if you could warp space-time in a low energy system by changing the value of that constant, then you could produce the Sarfatti always talks about the like 5 observables or 6 observables. This is a thing that Lou Elizondo either invented or at least popularized, where they're like the set of observable features that
I feel like I've seen this like in a History UFOs Channel documentary. Yeah.
And so one of them is like instantaneous acceleration and whatnot. And Sarfatti's basically saying, it appears to us as if it's instantaneously accelerating, but if you were inside, and it's accelerating in such a way. This is one of the things that like when in 2017 when the New York Times article came out about the Tic Tac videos, the Nimitz and the Go Fast, whatever they're called. People were saying, this breaks the laws of physics as we understand it. And the reason for that is because the kinds of accelerations that these craft were making would put G-forces on the craft that would tear the craft apart, that would smash, the bodies of any person that was inside of them. So like you physically are not capable of accelerating in the ways that supposedly these videos of these crafts show that they are able to accelerate. And so Sarfatti takes these videos as sort of prima facie evidence that these kinds of crafts exist, and therefore as evidence in favor of all of his fringe, non-accepted theories about quantum mechanics and general relativity that he has developed to explain these observable phenomenon about the UFOs. Right. So it's sort of this circular logic whereby, he says he's got this extension of quantum mechanics and an extension of general relativity, and that it tells you that, you can manipulate space-time with low energy. And then when asked, of course, there's all this mathematical formalism that, explains it. So there's the math there. But then when asked, like, well, what's the evidence for this? He just says, well, the Tic Tacs. Like, you've seen the Tic Tacs. They do.
Right, yeah.
So it's an uncritically accepting that, like, these videos that have been leaked are just... And he always loves to say on his podcast episodes that, well, I know for a fact they exist. And, like, I haven't seen them, but I've seen a video of them. And I've got all these high-level government inside sources, and they're telling me this.
Yeah, which is probably just him talking to Grok, if anything. Yeah.
Or people
like
within the government
generals saying keep your eyes
who
in
are
the skies.
actively trying to mislead him and use him as a disinformation asset.
Yes.
On that episode of whatever was Star Talk Radio that I listened to, at the end of it, they invite this guy on who's like an Air Force veteran who's known on the show as like Random Guy or something like that.
Okay.
And he starts like asking Sarfatti questions, and he basically says that like he was involved with basically every aircraft in every level of, secrecy that the U.S. government uses. And so he knows what all the real things are. And so he's like asking Sarfatti about these things, but it's really funny because he's like so sycophantic to Sarfatti and constantly stroking his ego and telling him how smart he is, and then inviting him to come to Las Vegas and have drinks with him and stuff. So it really seems like this is a guy who is trying to ingratiate himself with Sarfatti so that they can meet, and then he can become. And this guy's asking Sarfatti questions, and Sarfatti starts like, who are you? I got to ask you questions. How do you know this stuff is true? And the guy like refuses to talk about it. He's like, well, I can't talk about anything I saw in my work because it's classified and I'm under an NDA, whatever. I don't want to get sued. But I'm not ready to talk on air. But like, if you come meet me in Vegas, like, I'll tell you about it. So it's really seemed like this guy is essentially trying to recruit Sarfatti to come feed him bullshit or whatever.
Yes.
And I mean, I think this is one of the things that keeps coming up in this book and in basically everything that you see and read about Sarfatti is that like he is the most arrogant person
yes
to ever
unbelievably
exist.
obnoxious, arrogant. Yeah.
And he, this actually comes up multiple times in the book and in other things where like he is so confident in himself, and also he essentially has like messianic views about himself that he's destined. And of course, this God phone call from his experience as a kid is part of it. But I also listened to this recording. It's on Sarfatti's SoundCloud, which he claims is a recording of a meeting that happened in 1973 at SRI, Stanford Research Institute, where he first met Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff and the guys at SRI who were doing the remote viewing. And it was right after Uri Geller had come to SRI, and, you know, they're there, whatnot. And in that meeting, So one of them are asking, they're talking about psychic phenomenon and Uri Geller and whatnot. And they talk, Jack Sarfatti tells his God phone story, which, you know, again, this is 1973. It's a much less detailed version than what you hear him say today. And then one of the other people there, it's probably Hal Puthoff or Russell Targ, asks him, well, did you ever have, after this event, like psychic abilities? Because we've heard reports, you know, that people have these experiences then have psychic abilities. And he said, well, you know, I've always felt that I was like being drawn to these things and being destined for stuff. And he says, as in that discussion somewhere, that like even he had these feelings earlier from before he had this God phone call. So he has essentially like always had this kind of megalomaniacal, messianic, like neuroticism, where he believes that he is destined to save humanity in some way. And so, you know, I think that that makes him incredibly manipulable. And if you watch all these interviews with Sarfatti, I mean, I would kind of describe him as the most psyoped man ever, because he was the target of this, you know, God phone experience, and then was kind of constantly throughout the rest of his life sort of poked and prodded in the right direction by these various sort of spooky forces. And we can talk about more of the specifics of that as we get into the story, because
sorry. I just wanted to throw in something that maybe complicates it, but also underlines your theory that he's the most psyoped man in history. I don't know if you caught this in the How the Hippies Saved Physics book. It, you know, it does talk about the God phone call, but the specific story around it was something I hadn't heard before. According to this book, and I don't know who the author was directly interviewing, the way that kind of came to a head was there was a book that Sarfatti had read, and then it wasn't written by him or something like that.
Yeah,
but then he sent it to his mother.
Yeah,
right?
I can fill out the details here.
Okay.
If you want. So it was the book called Uri, the story of Uri Geller, written by Andrea Puharich.
Oh my God!
And he was given it. He was given this book specifically by Puharich when he met him in. This would have been sometime in the early 70s. I think it was before Sarfatti went to Europe, so it would have been like 1972 or 1973. This must have happened after the first SRI meeting. So again, it would have been like late summer 1973. And he's given this book, and he says, I don't have time to read it. So he gives it to his mom, and then he goes off to Europe. And his mom calls him and is like, Jack, like, the guy in this book, he had the same experience that you had, you know, with that phone call. And I've seen Sarfatti describe this in a couple different ways in different places. So it's not exactly clear what the timeline is and what the structure is. But basically, as Sarfatti tells it, he only ever remembered, well, in some tellings, he didn't remember this event at all.
Right.
But I am fairly confident that that's wrong. Although, again, the timeline's muddy, because in this recording that he's posted on his SoundCloud that is supposedly from the first time he went to SRI in the summer of 1973, and it would have been before he got this book from Andrija Puharich, he tells the story about his God phone thing. So he did have some memory of it before then. But he has told the story that he had no memory of it until his mom called him and told him, like, hey, this guy had the same experience that you had. And basically, I think that the term God phone comes from Uri Geller, and it may even come straight out of this Uri book by Andrija
Written
Puharich.
by Puharich. Which was a pretty like manic endorsement of him, and like it was definitely trying to hype up Uri Geller as like to become a celebrity.
And Puharich was very much his hype man. And so, you know, Geller, again, his Sarfatti's mom reads this book where Geller tells of having a similar experience. He gets called by phone. And Sarfatti says that, again, like in the most common telling, he remembered one phone call, but then his mom reminded him that, like, no, this phone was calling you for days, and you would, like, walk around the house seeming like you were in, like, a hypnotic stupor. Like, you know, I couldn't get your attention, and, like, you were possessed almost by whatever was on the phone. And then at some point, I grabbed the phone, and I was like, who is this, and why are you talking to my son? And then she heard the voice, which was this like computerized, robotic sounding voice that told her, again, the same thing that it had told Jack, that it was a conscious AI aboard a UFO that was orbiting Earth, and it was calling him, again, along with the story that you said earlier, so in order to recruit him into a special program to build UFOs, basically. And do you want to join? If you do want to join, then 20 years from now, you'll meet the other people who I've called to do this. So again, that's another piece of evidence that Sarfatti takes as verification that this thing is real, because he did. It was almost exactly 20 years later. You know, it was 1953, he said, when he got the phone call, and it was 1973 when he first goes to SRI and learns that Uri Geller had this experience, and Hal Puthoff had the experience, and Edgar Mitchell had the experience. Now, there's something very interesting in that discussion where one of the other guys who was at that meeting is somebody that I had not heard of at the time, whose name is Brendan O'Regan.
Right.
And this Brendan O'Regan guy, he was an SRI staff member. He was actually one of the people that helped write the Changing Images of Man document, you know, which you guys also did an episode about. That came out in 1982. And so he was kind of involved in that whole process of SRI studying how to transform the way human beings conceive of themselves, and how these images of human self-conception affect the development of societies and sciences and cultures and all these things. And it turns out that Brendan O'Regan was, at least in some tellings by Jack Sarfatti, an intelligence officer. Here's a quote I have from an article that I'm not able to find any copies of online yet, but I have found some places that reproduce quotes from this. So this is an article that Sarfatti wrote called Quantum Quackers. So he says, I was then simply a young, inexperienced, naive, quote, useful idiot, and in a very, very sophisticated and successful covert psychological warfare operation run by the late Brendan O'Regan of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and the late Harold Shipman, who was the CIA station chief responsible for all mind control research in the Bay Area in the 70s. Right. Shipman, a.k.a., quote, Orwell, funded me openly for a while in 1985, and was when he was allegedly no longer in the CIA, and covertly before that, and told me much of the story. In fact, he even introduced me to a beautiful woman, adventurer agent, who was one of his remote viewing subjects, who later became my live-in significant other. So here is Sarfatti essentially saying that he believes, at the time that he wrote this, again, I don't know when this article is written, but my guess is late 90s, early 2000s, that at that time he had the belief that he was essentially had been recruited into some type of psychological warfare operation run by this Brendan O'Regan guy. And I found elsewhere, I'm not exactly remembering where now, but Sarfatti says that at that 1973 meeting, when he first meets Targan Puthoff, that and this is not in the recording just cuts off at some point, but that Brendan O'Regan said, oh yes, I've seen data on 100 or so of these kinds of incidents, of this God phone call type thing. So this Brendan O'Regan guy was actively encouraging this belief in Sarfatti, giving him outside verification of it. An interesting thing that is included in Keiser's book and How the Hippies Saved Physics is that, and we can get more into this, is that it was Brendan O'Regan who suggested at that meeting, again, Sarfatti, this is the summer of 1973. In the fall of 1973, Sarfatti left California and went on a year-long sabbatical in Europe. He was invited to work at a lab in Italy, in Trieste, Italy. That was
in Trieste, right? Yeah, that he said in one interview, because that perked my radar, knowing like I just covered on like demon forces, like one of the first crises of the Cold War was over Trieste, and Tito and the Allies were kind of fighting over, does it go to Italy or does it go to Yugoslavia? And he brought up in one of the recent interviews, or maybe not, it was maybe from 2018, but I did find him say, comment on that a little bit, and was like, oh, Trieste. I actually don't know if it's in Italian. It should be pronounced Trieste, right? But everyone, British people call it Trieste. It's very confusing. But either way, that he said, oh, well, that was like right next to Yugoslavia. And, it was during the Cold War. Like, this place was a huge bed of, like, Cold War, intrigue. And later I found out I was there because it's part of a CIA program. But anyways, so he does claim that, like, that was not unconnected to, like, Cold War politics being sent to this big physics institute. And actually, he says that he and some other physicists that were there got to go. He went to the Physics Institute of Ljubljana, the capital of the Slovenian Republic, in Yugoslavia. And then another guy, I think, went to Sofia, Bulgaria. He doesn't name the person, but said,
yes,
and that
Fred
guy,
Alan
like,
Wolf.
Oh, is that Fred Wolf?
Yeah, I found where he does. I found some place where he does talk about it, and it's Fred Alan Wolf. Yeah.
Oh, so Sarfatti says, I believe he said that. Oh, and that guy, he went down there and ended up falling in love with like the daughter of the Bulgarian Communist Party. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, so interesting.
An interesting little connection here, which the connection that will come back. I don't know exactly about the timing, but around that time in the late 70s and early 80s. Again, so maybe this is a little bit later than this time, but a very, very important and influential person in Bulgaria and who was very in tight with all the Bulgarian secret services was Robert Maxwell. And Maxwell, he was, some people, I forget, gave him the nickname essentially like the King of Bulgaria, because every time he would come, he was treated with like this red carpet surface, and he'd sail his yacht up into the Black Sea and go there. And he used his relationship with the security services there to sell them the Promise software so that they could be spied on by Israel and the CIA. And so, there's that whole connection. There's another Robert Maxwell connection to this story at some point later, although actually it happens earlier in time, but we can get to it later. But yeah, that's a little thing that's interesting. I think also it's worth mentioning that the lab in Trieste that he's invited to is at this nuclear science research center that is run by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Mm-hmm. So this is an international body managed by UNESCO that was set up to monitor, to control and influence some, regulation over international atomic energy research. This was the body that, for example, at some time, and Sarfatti mentions this in one of his interviews that I found, was, sending weapons inspectors into Iran and into Iraq and whatnot. So, that even just the research center that he was invited here to work at was like kind of spooked up. And I mean, I think you're not wrong to say that it was probably a major center of Cold War scientific espionage and things. And it was sort of this bridge site between the scientific world behind the Iron Curtain, so to speak, and, the free world.
It would sort of have echoes of what people at the Esalen Institute and some of the fundamental physics group people would kind of get into in the later 70s and 80s, right?
Yes.
In terms of like everything culminating in the, Boris Yeltsin in that hot tub. No, actually, I don't know. Still don't know if he literally was in the hot spring, the nude hot spring thing, but they did bring him to the U.S. in 1989 and allegedly converted him to capitalism by taking him to a grocery store, a story which I do not buy on so many levels. But the scenes that Sarfatti would repeatedly be connected with, whether it's SRI, Uri Geller, the Institute in Trieste, or the Esalen Institute, which he beefed with sometimes, but still, had this underground kind of connection with Soviet scientists, and which eventually was not insignificant in the latter days of the Cold War in terms of how everything shook out, right?
Yeah. And I mean, also Sarfatti in the 80s, he becomes an ultra right-wing Reaganite, and he's proposing all of these strategic defense initiative things, trying to get grants from the Reagan administration and the CIA and whatnot. Yeah. So he's, kind of active, but still on the periphery in that scene as well. Yeah, so while he's in Europe, Sarfatti also goes over, along with Fred Alan Wolf, and does research in the UK at Birkbeck College with David Bohm, who we spoke about in the previous quantum mechanics episode.
And he still has a respect for David Bohm. He's not anti-Bohmian.
All of his post quantum mechanics stuff is all building on Bohm's pilot wave theory, so it's all essentially extending that stuff. I think this is one of the things that was interesting to me. I think I spoke about this on the cybernetics episode, but I've kind of had this idea banging around in my head about, even dating back to when we first did the first quantum mechanics episode, that there's some sort of scientific counterintelligence or counterinsurgency program going on here that with in the story that we kind of tell in the Copemorehagen episode, as you Dimitri coined it, the Copemorehagen deception.
Oh, I don't think I coined that.
I believe that was
Mike. Mike coined it.
No, I
but that is a great
I think
turn
I
of phrase.
coined it, didn't I?
Oh, there you go.
Okay, all right.
Mike coined it.
I don't mean to step on anyone's toes.
No, I mean, we had two, I think we had two puns, and I don't know, maybe it was Mike who came up with Copemorehagen, but I don't
Either
don't
way.
know. Yeah.
Oh, Copemorehagen Deception, I think, was the first, and then we added Copemorehagen. One of us added Copemorehagen
make sense.
live.
Yeah, I feel like there was another
magic.
pun that we were floating around in that episode, but I definitely came up with at least one of them.
Yeah. So, let me actually sort of trace a little bit of the history here, because I do think that this is kind of important in the context, and just to give people a kind of refresher of what's going on. So, quantum mechanics started in the early 20th century, 1900, 1905 are some of the first papers that observe some of these quantum-like effects. And it's not till 1927 at a what's known as the Solvay Congress. There were a series of these Solvay Congresses. Solvay is named after this guy, Ernest Solvay, who was an industrialist who liked to sponsor physics research. But at the Solvay Congress in 1927 is when a bunch of the sort of core components of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics start to come together, and there's a lot of kind of debate about them. And that is when Einstein gets really unhappy with these things and is giving people a bunch of trouble about it and saying this doesn't make sense. We've got to go back to how does this really mean? And that's what sparks what's known as the Bohr-Einstein debates, where Bohr and Einstein are kind of debating about the interpretation of quantum mechanics. eventually leading to Einstein's 1936 paper with Podolsky and Rosen about spooky action at a distance. And just it's probably worth going over, I have kind of a definition of the Copemorehagen interpretation and what sort of pieces that includes. So this came from, forgetting exactly the author now, but a book I have on basically refuting all of like Sarfatti and Fred Alan Wolf's and whatever's ideas about quantum mysticism and stuff. It's called The Unconscious Quantum by Victor Stegnar. Victor Stegnar has sort of become like a Dawkins type, like, you know, new atheists, anti-God kind of guy. But this is a book that's kind of a good refutation of Sarfatti's views. And here's the definition he gives of the Copemorehagen interpretation. So it includes 5 points. 1, the uncertainty principle of Heisenberg. This includes wave-particle duality, the role of canonically conjugate variables, and the impossibility of simultaneously measuring pairs of such variables to arbitrary accuracy. 2, the statistical interpretation of Born. This includes the meaning of the wave function given by the probability law of the absolute value of psi squared. And the psi, again, is just the wave function. And the predictivity of the formalism only for the average behavior of a group of similar events. That's an important part of quantum mechanics. Basically, like, you can't predict where one individual particle will go, but you can predict over a series of 1,000 or 1,000,000 of these, you know, instances within an experiment. You can predict what the statistical pattern of the entire population will be.
Right.
3, the complementarity concept of Bohr. This includes the, quote, wholeness of the microscopic system and the macroscopic measurement apparatus, the complementary nature of wave-particle duality, and the character of the uncertainty principle as an intrinsic property of nature rather than a peculiarity of the measurement process. 4, the identification of the wave function with, quote, knowledge of the system by Heisenberg. This includes the identification itself and the use of this concept to explain the collapse of the wave function and to eliminate simple non-locality problems. That collapse of the wave function is sort of an important part. This is really the part that leads everyone down the path that Sarfatti and folks go down in the 1970s, which is to say that, like, consciousness is an essential, important part of the universe, and that it is actually, the collapse of the wave function is essentially when the description of a particle as a smeared out set of possible probabilities is collapsed down to a specific definite value by the act of measurement, or in some cases, what people frame it by consciousness. Right. And then the final thing is the positivism of Heisenberg. This includes declining to discuss meaning or reality and focusing on interpretive discussions on observables. And we talked about positivism in the last episode, and logical positivism, and how that whole movement within the philosophy of science in the early 20th century really influenced the development of quantum mechanics. So, yeah, those things start to come together in 1927, and it's not, again, we discussed this in the first episode, until after the war in the 1950s, when obviously this scientific community, which is mostly centered in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, really gets spread out all across the world and broken up by the Nazis and by World War II. And most of these people come to America. Some of them go to the UK. As we discussed, Heisenberg and a few others stay in Germany during the war. And it's not until the 1950s that this set of views, these 5 sort of principles, are solidified into an orthodoxy by the community. So Einstein, of course, right, didn't like all this, and his protege at the time, he was at Princeton, was this guy, again, who we talked about last time, David Bohm. And in 1952, Bohm wrote the first paper on, quote, hidden variables, basically an explanation of quantum mechanics that is causal. One of the problems that a lot of people had in this point two there, the statistical interpretation of Born of the wave function, is this idea that quantum mechanics had lost the conception of causality, where basically how some measurement that you make in your physics lab comes out essentially just comes down to a random dice roll at the moment of measurement. And Einstein, didn't like that. So in 1952, Bohm publishes this paper, and that's right at the time that Bohm is also getting wrapped up in the House Un-American Activities Committee and being essentially blackballed from American academic life and exiled. And so he ends up in, eventually after some stops in Brazil and Israel, at Birkbeck College in London. And he kind of keeps working somewhat on the margins on his hidden variable theories and stuff like that. And then just continuing the story to what we eventually get with this fundamental physics group, there was a famous paper in 1964 by this researcher at CERN named John Bell, who he essentially shows in this paper, he's doing an analysis. He rederives the EPR thought experiment in a more concrete way that's more amenable to experimental testing. And he essentially shows that this debate between Einstein and Bohr about is the universe, real, so to speak, do these particles actually have definite momentum and position and whatnot before we measure them, or do those values come into existence through the act of measurement? Bell basically comes up with this way in which you could tell the difference between those two hypotheses. And he derives this thing called Bell's inequality that essentially shows you, if you were to do this particular experiment that's derived from Einstein's EPR paper, you could determine which one of these things is most likely. And, that what David Keiser, when he talks about the title, How the Hippies Saved Physics, of this book, one of the main ways he says what the hippies did to save physics is start talking about Bell's inequality and these papers that Bell had written, and get down to these questions of interpretation about quantum mechanics, which over the interceding 30 years or whatever had been kind of ignored by the physics community.
Jack Sarfatti was asked by the CIA to answer a fascinating question. Not, are they real, but accepting that they do exist, to answer this question. How do UFOs work?
The flying saucers are real. We know exactly how they work now in terms of mainstream physics. Right. Whenever you hear people say that the technology is thousands, million years ahead of us, that's false. These people do not believe anything they say. They're not real physicists. They don't know what they're talking about. The physics behind the flying saucers is quite elementary application of Einstein's general theory of relativity over 100 years ago, and some elementary applications of quantum mechanics in solid-state, condensed matter, metamaterial physics.
Metamaterials can be defined as artificially structured materials to control and mold the flow of electromagnetic waves, or possibly other types of physical wave. Metamaterials have structure to refract electromagnetic energy, often fine-tuned to specific wavelengths. For example, to randomly scatter radar energy, reflecting off the skin of a stealthy aircraft. Today we have developed metamaterials that can be made to interact with the full spectrum of EM frequencies.
What the UFOs are doing, they are able to control the gravity field inside their thin metamaterial shell fuselages. They're controlling their it's basically the active mass of those metamaterials manipulates the gravity field, with K being very big, and it's manipulating it with a very small amount of energy density, let's call it. The energy density that you need to accomplish it is quite small, where what you're interested in is generating what kind of gravity field, what's called a near gravity field, is confined just to the material, to the thin shell material, and what kind of gravity field is created in there, because also the speed of light in that material depends on the frequency of the light. So it gets very, very complicated. And as it turns out, this is pretty much unexplored territory in physics. The physicists have not really adequately studied this, which is why the motion of these UFOs appears mysterious to them. This is what Kevin Knuth in his papers has shown. The UFOs, they appear to be requiring thousands of Gs, which is impossible. It would rip everything apart, would kill anybody inside. But in fact, the people inside are free floating. So in a way, it's kind of an optical illusion from the gravity, from the warping of space and time, of the warp field that's inside the fuselage, the metamaterial fuselage of the craft.
So yeah, I just wanted to give that kind of background. I think there's an interesting bit here. I pulled this from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page on Bohmian mechanics, but which kind of talks about some of this history. Basically, I'll just read it and then just give some commentary on it.
Mm-hmm.
In a celebrated paper he published in 1964, Bell showed that quantum theory itself is irreducibly non-local. More precisely, Bell's analysis applies to single world version of quantum theory, i.e. not the multiple worlds, the many worlds interpretation. This fact about quantum mechanics, based as it is on a short and mathematically simple analysis, could have been recognized soon after the discovery of quantum theory in the 1920s. That this did not happen is no doubt due in part to the obscurity of the orthodox quantum theory and to the ambiguity of its commitments. And so this is kind of getting at one of these problems in physics that Keiser sort of says the hippies, helped save, is that, going all the way back to the 1920s, at even that Solvay conference, Louis de Broglie basically had the outlines of Bohm's theory in 1927, mm-hmm. but he presented it at the conference and it didn't receive a very positive reception, and he kind of left it. And, so they talk about basically how there's a few other points where essentially the same kind of thing could have been invented, but it never did, essentially because of the kind of orthodoxy of quantum mechanics. And we talked about last time, too, about how because Bohm was exiled as part of the House on American Activities, witch hunts, he was essentially ignored by mainstream physics.
Which is funny, because one of the craziest things in the How the Hippies Saved Physics book, which I feel like we should at least briefly mention, is the role of Ira Einhorn in all of this, and how incredibly influential he was on all of them, and what close friends he was with Jack Sarfatti, and it's so crazy. He
was really central to this entire physics network of people passing around. He was they said, I think the book said, was sort of the listserv before the internet of using the services of the Bell Telephone Company, or I forget if it was Bell or if it was Bell.
It was Bell.
Mm-hmm. There goes Sus Bell, the which technocracy.
Yeah, it was mentioned. I was thinking about
ideal
that too.
model.
Yeah.
Well, this is another, I think, really interesting thing where essentially, all these people who are on the fringe start kind of communicating with each other through Einhorn's network. And Einhorn really liked to make sure that not just fringe people, but really well-respected physicists and whatnot were receiving his papers. And this is where all these initial discussions on Bell's inequality and the underlying meanings of quantum mechanics and everything really start to get going. And these guys within the fundamental physics group, I think we should also maybe introduce that group a little bit more, because I do want to talk about the background of the people in it, because while Sarfatti is the paradigmatic example of psyoped gifted kid who's been told that he's going to solve the world and has been monitored by state intelligence services for his entire life, pretty much every other person in the group also had connections to various different spook outfits from early on in their life. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the other people have also kind of led interesting lives, although they're more on the peripheries of, the kind of UFO madness than Sarfatti is right now. But yeah, Einhorn had created this network to distribute all this information, and he was like really critical in getting Uri Geller to SRI, and also eventually, this is where I kind of went off on this diversion to talk about Bell's theorem, but the reason for that is because after Sarfatti was in Trieste, he went there in the fall of 1973. The next semester, starting in the spring or winter of 1974, he goes to Birkbeck College, London, and works with David Bohm. And while he's there, Uri Geller is brought to London and is given a bunch of tests by Bohm and one of Bohm's colleagues at Birkbeck College. And I found this very good paper. I didn't get all the way through it, but it's quite interesting. I think you guys would be interested as well, entitled Radical Physics, Science, Socialism, and the Paranormal at Birkbeck College in the 1970s by Joanna Bork, published in 2019. And she kind of talks about the details of these experiments that were done on Uri Geller by Bohm and John Hasted. But one of the things that kind of brought me to this is that in How the Hippies Saved Physics, it's mentioned that specifically Brendan O'Regan at SRI asked Jack Sarfatti, when he first came to SRI in 1973, right before he's going to Europe, if he would introduce Uri Geller to these people in Europe. So this guy, who again, Sarfatti has identified in other places as being a CIA asset and who was involved with Edgar Mitchell's Institute of Noetic Sciences in order to pass through all these funds for SRI to do the remote viewing experiences. This guy specifically pointed Sarfatti to Bohm and said, bring Uri Geller there. And the other guy, Bohm's colleague, who is actually even more into the parapsychology stuff than Bohm was, is this guy named John Hasted. I don't know too much about him, but there are some interesting excerpts from this paper that are talking about the weirdness that happened when Uri Geller was brought to Birkbeck. And here's some quotes about Bohm testing Uri Geller. So Bohm was impressed, but he was much more cautious. Unfortunately, there were a lot of people in the room, he conceded, adding that as far as the key bending is concerned, we had much better conditions in his hotel room, where it was much quieter. This is an interesting point that keeps coming up in these tests of Uri Geller, that like he can't really do his things under very controlled circumstances, and he would always get like upset with the people around him, be like, oh no, you don't understand, like I have to be in this really good mood in order to do it. And if I'm not in the right mood, I'm not in the right mindset, then I'm not going to be able to do my powers. And so when you set up all of these control conditions that are designed to be able to make this a rigorous experiment and therefore be able to demonstrate that this is a real phenomenon, well, all of a sudden, once you do that, I can't do it anymore. And there's something quite sort of quantum or complementary about that. It's this idea that like, if you set up the double slit experiment in a particular way, you're not going to see the interference pattern. You're only going to see particles. And if you set it up in a different way, you're going to get the interference pattern. It's almost like Geller is sort of telling them that that's how he works. Is continuing on in this section. He acknowledged that he could never be certain that there were no tricks because Geller works in a very high state of excitement, which communicates to the experimenter and that makes it hard to keep your mind on what's happening. In a statement that is to be echoed repeatedly by the proponents of paranormal activity, Bohm reminded skeptics that paranormal effects required a particular state of mind. Subjecting Geller to a body search prior to the experiment would be counterproductive. Bohm believed because, quote, it would put him off. Geller also, quote, tends to get discouraged by complicated setups. He noted, adding that, quote, we had some setups that would have given much stronger proof, but he was never in the right state of mind. All in all, Bohm concluded, my attitude is that whatever he requires, we must accept. And after this set of testing, like Jack Sarfatti came out and made this really bombastic press statement saying, like, as a trained theoretical physicist, like, I believe this.
Yeah.
We watched it all, and like I believe that he couldn't have done this otherwise. So there was this whole circumstance of like they're testing him in the lab with a lot of people present. Other people that were present included Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer, Arthur Koestler, who was also a famous sort of anti-communist writer, the president of the British Society for Psychical Research,
right,
which is an organization that goes back to the late 19th century, and is very connected to, I believe, the first president of the British Society for Psychical Research was what's his name? I'm forgetting his first name, but Balfour of the Balfour Declaration, who went on after he founded this to be Prime Minister of the UK.
Right.
They also bring Geller to less controlled circumstances, including he's invited to the house of this guy, John Hasted. This quote is kind of amazing about this experience. Hasted confessed that domestic tensions arose when Geller visited his home. In the presence of Hasted and his wife, objects moved between rooms, and a clock that had been silent for 30 years suddenly chimed.
Okay.
Hasted's wife, who had been deeply dismissive of paranormal prior to Geller's visit, became, quote, increasingly frightened when poltergeist-type phenomenon took place. Hasted admitted that it was a, quote, hard time for my wife and I. We nearly fell out. We had quite serious emotional troubles about it. So, like, Geller gets brought to their house and, like, gang stalks them, essentially.
Well, okay, now this is reminding me of, remember I found that book about like Uri Geller, Super Spy, that we didn't get to read all, like, the whole thing, but in our last UFO Egg episodes, I read some examples of kind of similar behavior happening to scientists at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, where they brought Uri Geller after SRI because I think the U.S. national security apparatus is worried about if he could move atoms with his, if he could like smash atoms together with his mind and like cause a nuclear explosion or set off a bomb, that would be very bad. And then like little kind of like holographic like mini UFOs started like popping up in inside of their laboratories. And then I think it was put off in Targ that in the Third Eye Spies book they relayed, or it was in one of the other. No. I think this was in the Uri Geller book. But like some of these guys, remember there was the hotel room and the guy with like one arm, and then there was like a spinning arm. There was a spinning arm that materialized in their room, and then they got a knock on the door, and like a very Lynchian like one-armed man in a gray suit like walked in weirdly like an MIB, and then was like, I must have the wrong room, and then left. And they were just completely like, for like these scientists were very freaked out and like disturbed by whatever the hell was going on. It seemed to follow Uri Geller around. They tried to sort of break down like, could that have been the CIA or could it have been the KGB even like messing with them? But it was just like too weird for them to think that it was like merely an intelligence agency. It's hard to tell what to make, because then Sarfatti full-throated endorses Uri Geller first, and then I believe they bring in a magician at a certain point, right?
Yeah, James Randi.
Right. And he shows some of these people.
James Randi, the ultimate.
Right. Yeah. I was just at the Magic Castle last night, so this is kind of fresh in my mind of like, what a stage magician can do, and what Uri Geller was doing in front of people. And like, I saw some generally mind-bending things last night where I don't know exactly how it happened, where these things materialize from. I don't know.
Right.
But, there's obviously a way they do it, and there's tricks. So I think that poured a lot of cold water on Uri Geller, because this guy pointed out that he did things like bent spoons in front of him and is like, see, I can do it. And it's fake. Like, I'm a magician. And so then they were like, oh no, we've been had. And then Sarfatti kind of like issued a letter stepping back from Uri Geller and being like, I was deceived, like actually, like upon further review, this is bullshit. But then like years later, he'd come back around again and retract his retraction and say, actually, like your Uri Geller like did have something legitimate going on there. Like he really was using some.
Well, I mean, I feel like that's kind of the thing though, is that like the standards of evidence are all like about replication and like being able to like do these things like repeatedly in a controlled environment, which like is explicitly like whether you like accept it or not, it's clearly not the nature of this, whether it's because it's a trick and like it just can't be done in a controlled environment because it requires like having hidden components in order to like, you know, create these illusions, or like he needs to be in the right mind state or whatever. Like it's obviously not subject to the evidential standards of like the ordinary scientific method. And I feel like that's also kind of true of everything that Jack Sarfatti is talking about today. Like just to go like all the way back to when you mentioned earlier, Jay, like metamaterials. Like what are those and like where are they and why can't we see them? You know, like that's the thing.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh yeah, we have like, you know, Tom DeLonge has like on his bookshelf, or like Jack Valet has in his pocket this magical material that can like resolve all these paradoxes and solve these problems, but you can't see it. We're not going to demonstrate it. And like, sorry. Like, you know, it's kind of like...
Yeah, and all these UFO people also talk about, like, you know, crash retrieval artifacts, and, like, one of the thing, you know, this artifact is, like, it's not something that humans have the capacity to manufacture or stuff like that, you know? And that kind of comes up a lot in the UFO subculture and whatnot, and people, you know, leaking and all these things. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do know what Sarfatti means by metamaterial, which is essentially just, it's a material made with sort of nanotechnology that's basically like a quilt at the nanoscale.
Okay.
Where like weaving together different types of material into a patchwork that on the macroscopic scale all of a sudden has new properties that didn't exist in any of these little bits of material independently. So for the prototypical example of things like this is that you could, for example, create lenses that bend light in more complicated ways. Like the lenses in your glasses, or the lenses, of course, like in your eyes.
Yeah.
Like they work by focusing
like an
light
invisibility
to a point.
cloak or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you could make like an invisibility cloak with these metamaterials, essentially by making light bend around you when it hits the metamaterial and stuff like that. That's the if you go look them up on Wikipedia or whatever, that's the canonical example. They have these like metamaterial lenses that can bend light in more complicated ways. Whereas like, you know, the lenses in your glasses just work because they're different thicknesses on different parts of them, and light travels through the glass at a different speed than it travels through air. So like in the thin parts, there's less glass, and in the thick parts, there's more glass. And it, you know, the different speeds essentially, you know, lead to like a bending effect. But like with a metamaterial, you could make all these weird, complicated patterns about how it reacts. And of course, Sarfatti believes that like you can also change this gravitational constant or whatever it is. I don't quite remember.
Yeah, I feel like I guess there's a gradation of metamaterials. Like, yeah, I see what you're saying where like the like invisibility thing. Yeah, I guess if that's a result of metamaterials, then yeah, I guess there's all different types of metamaterials one could make. But I feel like there's a difference between that and like, yeah, changing a gravitational constant. That seems like a big leap from like bending light in a different way than a lens.
I can't claim to understand how he says that works, but I have seen him say that in many lectures.
Yeah.
So I'm not exactly sure how he's proposing that works. I mean, I think one of the other things that's interesting about this visit of Uri Geller to Britain is he goes on the BBC and has like a big press conference. This is all, of course, also organized by Andrea Puharich, along with, you know, some of these guys in the background from SRI, like Brendan O'Regan. And in response to Uri Geller's BBC press conference, all of a sudden there are all of these children reporting that they have psychic powers and that they discovered their psychic powers while they were watching Uri Geller on TV. So there's two examples of kids, and they get brought into Birkbeck by this guy, John Hasted, and he keeps kind of studying them and stuff. But yeah, there's this phenomenon where multiple kids come forward and like their families will say, oh, we were watching TV and we were watching this Uri Geller thing, and then all of a sudden like the spoon in my son's hand just like started melting and it bent. And there are different examples of this. And then, these people come forward and they are tested and trained into doing it. And a lot of the kids end up making statements that are similar to what Geller said, whereas basically like, I can only do it when I'm in the right mood or in a certain circumstance. The kids didn't really understand how these powers worked in themselves. And so it was while they got brought in and tested in scientific conditions, it was, like you were saying earlier, Khalid, like not really in a something that, as the nature of the phenomenon itself, was repeatable, or at least that's seems to be how it was presented.
Yeah.
But I think that there's an interesting parallel there between these kids watching Uri Geller on TV, developing these patterns, and then, people, the God phone experiences of Geller himself and Sarfatti and all these other people.
Yeah.
So, the thing that struck me about this Birkbeck visit, both Hasted and Bohm were left-wing physicists. Bohm, of course, got exiled from being in the briefly the CPUSA, Communist Party of USA. And Hasted was sort of involved in British socialist movements and stuff like that. It's clear, if we trust Jack Sarfatti in some of these statements, which is a dubious proposition, but, Sarfatti says essentially that he was told to bring Geller there by this guy, Brendan O'Regan at SRI. This whole incident to me strikes me as like a counterintelligence sting operation, where Geller is brought in to essentially discredit these guys by making them endorse these psychic phenomenon that most of the physics community are going to just reject out of hand, and in that way essentially further marginalize Bohm while he's working on developing this hidden variables theory of quantum mechanics, this alternative explanation, which of course, according to Sarfatti, is correct. And if you extend it in the way Sarfatti has, it can explain to you how consciousness works and how AI works and how to make these conscious AI tic-tac warp drive devices and whatnot. Right? So, at least in Sarfatti's telling, this science is like incredibly important and was essentially not studied by mainstream physics for many years. There's actually, I went about reading reviews of this book just to see what people thought of it. And the review in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, I read each of those, and both of them basically said, it's an interesting physics book, but I think that Keiser is like overstating the degree to which this clique of people was really important in the development of quantum information science. Now, since that time, since the book came out and since all those reviews were written, one of the guys who was a member of the fundamental physics group with Sarfatti at Berkeley, a guy named John Clauser, has since won the Nobel Prize. And he won the Nobel Prize specifically for his experimental tests and confirmation of Bell's theorem.
Yes.
Which again and this is the thing that is...
This relates to the EPR thing too, right? Because I wanted to talk about that with relationship to the hidden variables thing, because as I read it in one place, I think it was in Somek's dissertation where he kind of summarizes the fundamental physics group, but he made it seem like part of the whole point of, like, part of the whole contribution of, like, the sort of rediscovery of Bell's theorem by the fundamental physics people and their sort of championing of it was that this, like, solved the problem of there having to be hidden variables, because this, had, like, this whole idea of let me see if I can bring it up so that I can remember properly what the idea was. It's according to this guy, Bell's paper refuted Einstein's famous argument of the non-locality of quantum mechanics the notion that two systems could become, quote, entangled with one another, such that the measurement of one would instantaneously affect the state of the other, even after separation across vast distances, what we talked about, was evidence of its incompleteness, necessitating the introduction of, quote, hidden variables, which would restore locality and fix the theory. Bell's theorem revealed the error in Einstein's logic. Entanglement, he showed, wasn't the weak link of quantum theory, it was what made quantum mechanics possible. This actually kind of sounds like an AI sentence, almost the way it's like, it's not this, but of course, humans also write like that. But yeah, so like that's interesting because I don't know, is that like an accurate assessment of okay.
As I understand it, so the issue, there are sort of two issues or ways that you can interpret Bell's inequality, Bell's theorem stuff. And you'll see it talked about in both ways. Is I think the way that Keiser talks about in the book, and that, as I understand it, is the most accepted nowadays interpretation, is that what Bell's inequality and the experimental verification of it show is that the universe is fundamentally non-local, basically meaning that events far away from each other in space can affect each other.
Right.
But the way many people took it, and that seems to be essentially what is being said in that paper, the way you just read it.
Yeah.
That Einstein was committed to locality because of general relativity, special and general relativity, which is, again, what I said before, that the speed of light is a universal speed limit, and no signals or information can travel faster than the speed of light. And so for any two things to be able to interact with each other, they have to be close enough to each other that some signal could go from one to the other by light speed and within that time, right? And that's the general idea of locality. Things have to be close to each other to interact. Whereas what the experimental confirmations of Bell's theorem show is that actually, that the universe is non-local. But many people interpreted it for many, many years as actually, and you still see after the 2022 Nobel Prize, there are a bunch of YouTube videos and whatnot that were made about this work. And you still see in a bunch of these people saying that what it actually shows is that the universe is not locally real. That basically that these particles and whatnot on a local sense don't have real definite values of momentum or position or whatever like this. So that's sort of, as I've seen it, been the kind of two ways that this is interpreted. Either it says, some people use it to say that the universe is truly not real, like there's no true thing out there without our observation of it.
Right.
Whereas what Bell and Bohm and these other people, the way they understood it was that it was demonstrating non-locality.
Right. Interesting.
That things are interconnected and they affect each other even from great distances.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not
the speed of light isn't a speed limit or whatever, Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that non-locality is what the members of the fundamental physics group, Sarfatti and some of these other people, latched onto as an explanation for remote viewing and extrasensory perception and UFOs and all of these other things.
So did Jack Sarfatti then change his mind and now he does believe in hidden variables, or what?
As I understand it, what he calls his theory post-quantum mechanics, or maybe with retro. As I understand it, it's essentially I believe that the hidden variables term is like sort of confusing, but essentially it's like it's an extension of Bohm's model, whereby like what Bohm says basically is that the particles are real and the wave function is real, and the wave function is this non-local thing where the effects of the wave, or the shape of the wave function, whatever, can be affected by disparate and distant parts of the experimental setup or whatever, and the wave function essentially acts as like a guiding wave that guides the particles along it. So you can think of like a beach ball being pushed around on the top of the ocean. when you're thinking about the particles, you're looking at this beach ball, but the beach ball is floating on this wave that kind of carries it and dictates where it's likely or not likely to go, as I understand it. And I believe Sarfatti essentially has, he's extended this in some way that now includes retrocausality and all these other things. And, he says that's his explanation for how this stuff works.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if that was helpful or not.
Yeah, I like don't quite get like the relationship between the hidden variable yet, but I mean maybe some out there do. Like what is, what are like what does the idea of hidden variables do for him? Like it seems like they wouldn't be hidden to him though. It seems like he's saying that he knows what they are.
Well, I think they're hidden because
they were hidden. Oh, okay, but no, they're not.
Yeah. They're hidden because you don't see them in the quantum mechanical experiments, right? Like in the experiments in the system, again, you can only predict the outcome of like the average of lots of different trials.
Right.
You can't predict the outcome of any individual trial. So the hidden variables would be telling you about the outcomes of individual trials. So as I understand it, I read this somewhere, but that the hidden variables like in Bohm's model are like the position and the momentum of the particles. Right? So on any given trial, the position and the momentum of the particles are real. They exist. Those are those hidden variables. But they're, not revealed until you make some measurement and they're given a definite value.
I see. Yeah, I'm looking at a he definitely like is into the pilot wave. I'm reading
the pilot wave is like Bohmian mechanics. Yeah. That's all kind of the same thing.
Right. I'm reading a slide. Yeah, sorry. Keep going.
No, I mean, Sarfatti, this whole group studied these, the fundamental physics group, which maybe at some point we should probably get a little more concrete about like the actual history here and where who the members were and whatnot. They got together. The first thing they were talking about were these papers by John Bell from 1964 and 1966, trying to understand this issue and basically bringing back the question which physics had been ignoring for so long of like, what is the interpretation of quantum mechanics?
Yeah.
I'll say, I don't know that I'm necessarily in the best position to answer all the
no, that's fair enough. Yeah.
I think that the history of this is sort of what is more interesting to me, because at every step of the way, there are these, how to put it, at every step of the way, there is a sort of intervention, or there is a character pops up who is somehow involved with state security, whether that's the CIA or the DIA or various army type groups, and that they play an important role in sort of guiding the various figures in the story into the important positions that they eventually kind of fall into in a way that is able to produce this history and this result that Keiser talks about of like the hippies saving physics. I want to briefly say, returning to it, I was talking about the reviews of this book, which mostly say that Keiser's overstating things. The best review that I found was from somebody on Reddit 13 years ago, so this must have been after right after the book came out. I won't shout out the Reddit user's name, not to attract attention to their account. It does still exist. But he says, or they say, I read this book from cover to cover, and all I have to say is this. The guy did a great job of disproving his own thesis. A more accurate title would have been, quote, How the Hippies Delayed the Advancement of Physics for 40 Years. And,
Ooh, okay.
I think in the terms of this show, maybe a more appropriate title would be like How the Hippies Occulted Physics. Because it strikes me as, well, of course, what the story Keiser tells is that like these are the guys who were responsible for bringing this issue of Bell's inequality back to discussion within mainstream physics, that, really all this stuff had been missed in the beginning because of the marginalization of David Bohm and of some other physicists, mostly for political and security-related reasons, right? Through the HUAC and everything, Bohm had come up with all this stuff, but was totally ignored, was not taught, his papers were not cited, nobody continued developing his work, mostly because he was like persona non grata, because he got attacked by HUAC. And as that quote I read earlier from the Stanford Encyclopedia page on Bohmian mechanics talked about, that, all of the stuff was in place to be discovered as early as like 1927, but nobody really put it together until in response to all of this agitation by members of the fundamental physics group in the 1970s. And that's when Bell's papers started to get cited more, and John Clauser, who's a member of the fundamental physics group, the guy who won the Nobel Prize in 2022 for his experimental verifications of it, he developed the experiment, and then somebody else did a more sophisticated one. That's kind of what happened over those 40 years. And even as these things got talked about more by these fundamental physics group's characters, they continued to be marginalized on the side of science because all these guys were into like remote viewing and UFOs and things like that.
And in some cases, like literally occult shit.
Yes. Well, yeah. Maybe we should get into the background of all these people because I can bring up some things about that in that context. But yeah, some of them were like legitimately practicing occult practices, including like theosophy and Scientology and things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So so this is a group that like coalesces in kind of the early to mid 1970s in Berkeley, California. And I think that one interesting context that the book harps on a lot, but then another, in certain types of way, almost like contradicts it a little bit, is the sort of like the economy of like postgraduate physics education and things like that in the context of the Cold War. It makes a big point that basically like the very late 1960s to early 1970s was kind of the first recession in sort of like the academic sciences since World War II, because obviously at the start of the Cold War, there was a huge increase in government funding to get like a whole new generation of scientists. You also had, GI Bill people going in, and like the number of PhDs in physics, given out from like the 50s up through like the early 70s absolutely exploded, especially in like the 10 years after Sputnik, right? But then, he cites multiple things where, the military planners, obviously there was the strain of Vietnam, and there was also a little bit of a kind of a questioning in the military-industrial complex about like the strategy of, I think they literally called it stockpiling physicists, for a future war with the Soviets, now seemed like maybe a kind of a wasteful, inefficient use of resources. There was also the extensive college protests, because a lot of this work was being done in universities where, like SRI was directly targeted, and even maybe like COINTELPRO by crazy Tom Mosher in a weird way, so that, it was bombed by somebody, and then they were trying to shut it down, and so they spun it off as a private entity and moved it off campus, blah, blah, blah. But the main point that this book makes is like most of these people ended up kind of marginalized, or not landing, not completely marginalized, but like not having the careers that they thought they might have, 10 years prior when they started, in college. And so a lot in the funding, like the defense industry funding especially, was to a large degree drying up, or at least it was on the sort of exoteric above ground level. It was drying up, because then the paradox of this is that, as the book does point out, that pretty quickly the Defense Department, the CIA, other agencies of national security nature, like get interested and actually start funding this, whether through like covert contracts to SRI with the kind of the Stargate program, or sometimes through these like interesting cutouts of people. Like there was, I forget the one guy in the 80s that I guess everybody speculated, like he'd been a former DIA agent or something like that.
Oh, I think this is George Koopman.
Yes, Koopman, exactly.
Yeah,
and I think he became a big funder of Sarfatti in the 80s and everyone. But I think even the fundamental physics group in the 70s, right? He just kind of shows up as this like angel investor and is like, wow, you guys are so interesting. I'm just going to, and so they surmise, they got weird vibes from him. It's like, yeah, that guy was probably like keeping tabs on us or something. So you do have national security kind of funding and quiet support for this, but it's done in such a more, like, even the way they do that is occulted. And it's like, they're playing these games with kind of scientific respectability with like Uri Geller and, kind of almost like wanting these people to be siloed off a little bit from kind of like the mainstream academy in a way, to cook up some wild shit. And then, I think the book talks a lot about how, I think probably central to their half tongue-in-cheek thesis that these hippies saved physics is it was Herbert's paper, right? Like in the late 70s that had some provocative like interpretations in it. And then it sort of led to a bunch of more established physicists publishing the rebuttals in journals, and the rebuttals were actually like much more popular than the original paper. And then like yada yada yada, like they get cited at various points and eventually lead to like some breakthroughs in quantum information transfer and shit like that, like in the 2000s. And it's a little bit so it's not a direct thing, and it was almost like as a reaction, like a dialectical reaction to some of these guys' ideas that the author alleges push the ball forward in overall physics.
Right.
But I don't know.
I think there's a bunch of things to hit on from what you just said. I think first, actually, the context that Keiser gives in the beginning about the sort of political economy of physics research, I think is pretty important. Mm-hmm. Obviously, like during World War II, there was this massive mobilization effort, particularly among the sciences and physics and engineering, to develop all of these kinds of
weapons,
weapons and radar and anti-artillery and all these things. And so this was all managed by the National Research Defense Council, NRDC, the president of which was Vannevar Bush, who's a guy who's kind of come up in this before. He's the founder of Raytheon, and at the time was maybe president of MIT or a dean within the engineering school at MIT or something like that. And his deputy in that is a guy named James Conant, who was the president of Harvard University at the time. And, so they mobilized a huge amount of physicists, and they helped develop radar, all these things. And of course, the most famous thing is the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. Then afterwards, after the war and in the 1950s, there was, of course, the McCarthyism, and physics historically was a community that was like pretty left leaning. And that's one of the reasons all these guys got targeted by McCarthyism. Of course, people have watched the Oppenheimer film. A huge part of that movie is the dramatization of Robert Oppenheimer's security hearings and him being questioned about whether he was a communist or a sympathizer, and which eventually led to the revocation of his security clearance, his Q security clearance, which Q clearance is something managed by the Atomic Energy Commission, or at least it was at the time. That doesn't exist anymore. So I think for one, it's not only that, right, there was this buildup of physicists, and in the same way Keiser talks about a CIA memo that essentially talks about like a physicist gap, in the way that there's like a missile gap, where it's saying like we're not training physicists at the way the Soviet Union is. I mean, it's really the exact same rhetoric as the missile gap type stuff, and later, there's a psi gap.
The psi gap, yeah.
And so that's part of what drives all of the development of these physics training programs and the training of all these people. And that's what brings all the members of the fundamental physics group sort of pays for their grad school, but then by the time they're done and they're trying to start their early career, like opportunities have kind of dried up.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is like really interesting here in terms of like parallels to the modern day is like this is not necessarily dissimilar to what's happening right now with like all the Trump Doge stuff.
I was just thinking that about like Anduril and Palantir trying kind of like we could do this like more efficiently in like kind of smaller, more just like tiny groups and more secretively.
And you're forcing all these people who had been working in academia, had been working in government research labs, have somewhere their funding is coming from a government grant, or even like, you know, all the Doge stuff has really ended up canceling a lot of private grants too, because the Trump administration has been going after private donors who make DEI-related grants.
Yeah.
You know, and it forces all these people out of the public sphere of science research and into these more shady private organizations that don't have the same commitment to publishing necessarily, who are more opaque in where the money is coming from, what the science is ultimately doing, things like that. So it is sort of in the way that, you know, Keiser talks about this, you know, is the 1970s stagflation and things like that. And so their budget cuts, you know, that leads to these guys who would have been part of mainstream physics all of a sudden getting kind of pushed onto the margins and having to search for private sources of funding to keep their careers going. Like, I think that is probably really happening today, and in one of the areas that's probably happening a lot is like AI research.
Yeah, there's like in this dissertation that I keep mentioning, I sent to you guys before, like there's like, this is like part of what appealed to me so much about this in the first chapter, where he makes this connection between, you know, he says basically what you're saying, where like, you know, if the Cold War had defined strict boundaries within which quantum theory might be useful, by the end of the century, it appeared that these borders were rapidly disintegrating. It was clear the story of quantum mechanics was not yet finished, that there was still much work to be done if physicists wanted to get to the bottom of it all. They wanted to understand existence itself. This endeavor, like those of the eras before it, was very much of its time. Looking back on the work of the fundamental physics group, it is impossible to ignore the group's particular politics, teetering uneasily between political activism and psychedelic escapism, haunted in equal parts by an Orientalist obsession with Eastern mysticism and an acquiescence to the patronage of the CIA and the Pentagon. But, you know, then he makes like a very interesting link to the present day, where he says, as for the cohort at the Santa Fe conference, none of the participants were directly associated with the physics group, talking about Wheeler, you know, I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit. These early investigations into quantum information share a certain faith in the transcendent, a conviction that the secrets of the universe were theirs to unlock and harness. These early quantum information theorists were not alone in this conviction, and one can see a distinct resonance between Wheeler's it from bit theory, again, we can talk about that a bit later, and another contemporaneous area of research circulating around the Santa Fe industry at the same time, the field of artificial life. Indeed, both fields share a common commitment to computation as a unifying principle of the cosmos, and both attempted to ground the secrets of the universe in the digital, reducing all of creation to a massive computer waiting to be programmed. This hubris, too, is part of our inheritance as quantum engineers. And that, like, terminology is interesting in light of the episode that we just did about like Technocracy Inc. and their sort of focus on the engineer. But, you know, he also like extends this a little bit. I'll just, you know, this is the last part, but, you know, I did want to read this at some point in this episode, so I think here's a good time. So he says, if the countercultural revival of the late century recalled in playful pantomime the solemn philosophizing of Bohr and Einstein, today we find the pendulum has once again swung. Here we must tread cautiously. While it is foolish to attempt a history of the present, to tell a story we are deep in the middle of, the conclusion yet unwritten, this is being, you know, this dissertation is from 2023, by the way, so, you know, not too long ago, but still, like, you can see a little bit of the prescience here. We can nonetheless trace a number of themes which animate quantum research in the present day, themes not altogether dissimilar from those which animated the wartime scientists of the mid-century. So, yeah, it is interesting. And the term he uses to kind of classify this era is the era of quantum supremacy, which is a term, I guess, that John Preskill used in 2011, like a pretty prominent physicist. But, yeah, he talks about this in terms of AI, right? So he says, Quantum supremacy, as I argue in length in part 5, is not simply a quantifiable technical milestone. It is an overarching narrative and myth in the post-structuralist sense, which has guided quantum mechanics research throughout the early decades of the 21st century. As such, the era of quantum supremacy in which we currently find ourselves is not, Pace Presskill, the era of demonstrable quantum advantage, though it may prove to be that too, but rather the era governed by the aspiration of supremacy and advantage. This definition will make many scientists uneasy, but the broad strokes are relatively uncontroversial. As quantum mechanics has entered the 21st century, a renewed emphasis has been placed on harnessing quantum theory towards quote-unquote useful ends, towards designing coherent physical systems which are faster, more powerful, and more secure than those which came before. Among the success stories of this era, we would include the successful deployment of quantum encryption between Vienna and Beijing in September 2017, the generation of large and controllable entangled states consisting of tens of qubits, and the first claimed demonstration of quantum supremacy by Google Quantum AI in 2019. For many scientists, these accomplishments stand as an arguable proof that the arc of scientific history bends toward progress. And yet, as we have seen in the preceding movement sketched above, the meaning of progress is not time invariant. Indeed, the aspiration of quantum computational advantage is a new invention, one which diverges profoundly from the aspirations of the physics group and the Santa Fe cohort, as well as their pre-war antecedents. Instead, the dream of quantum supremacy brings quantum mechanics back into resonance with the pragmatic aims of the wartime period, where philosophy is once again subordinated to results, to quantum metrics, to progress. And he goes on to talk about, how the geographic center of quantum research has shifted from psychedelic ashrams and privately endowed research centers to corporate laboratories of tech giants, Google, IBM, Microsoft, Amazon, and the teeming network of fledgling tech startups, each vying for their shot at an IPO or a lucrative acquisition. So, yeah, it's the same, process. I think, we might disagree a little bit about, his reading of the physics group as being so, out of step with that, with the pre-war establishment, even though there definitely are differences, and you definitely can, periodize them in this way. But yeah, it is, I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think especially that where he ended there, pointing out, and I think this is interesting that, quantum computing as a field is a field that, and I don't want to speak necessarily too strongly here because I'm not, immersed in this and totally sure of it, but to my understanding, it much more than other contemporary, modern scientific fields is dominated by private industry. That, the biggest labs for all these quantum computing stuff are at Google and Microsoft and IBM.
Right. Yeah.
And are not, and they may have affiliations with universities and things like that, but they're not primarily in universities in the realm of public and open science.
Yes. He has a sentence that actually says that exactly, where he says, whereas the Cold War period saw an enormous expansion in the United States' university system, today we find that much of the pedagogical infrastructure for training new quantum engineers is housed not in the academy, but in the online PR and outreach apparatuses of for-profit corporations, which have a deep financial interest in the success of quantum computing. Yeah.
And I think, again, I think that this also relates to, some of the Trump and Elon racism and immigration and stuff.
Yeah.
If you remember right at the beginning of the Trump administration, there was starting to show a split between Trump's more nativist base and the Elon and Doge technocrats over the issue of H-1B visas.
Right.
Because all these, tech people saw the necessity of the H-1B to be in terms of providing them with suitable candidates for the jobs that they want to fill. But another way to get suitable candidates is to cut all of the funding from the private sciences. So all these people who are currently employed at universities and public research institutions,
they have to work for
all
you.
of a sudden find that their positions there are much less secure, and that they might be better off jumping to go work for Palantir or Google, where they're going to make a lot more money anyway, and they were in the position that they're in, at least in part. Most of these people who choose to stay in some sort of academia and publicly funded science do so in some part because of the sort of noble ideas about being a part of this scientific endeavor and, independence or some sort of criticism in some, usually superficial way about corporations and their role in society and whatnot. But like they were always like turning down more money to do that. And part of the pull for that was this moral idea of, and so now you have like Trump and Elon come in and cut their funding out from under them and also make them start to question whether or not being a part of this public system is necessarily good for them or if it's meeting their, their sort of moral goals or whatever. And so you're gonna all of a sudden just change the landscape of the research community where many more of the talented trainees, either newly coming out of grad school, but also people who have established careers, are going to be on the market and available for work in these places. And they're going to be desperate because like they had a job and it got taken away from them. And now they're competing with all these other people who also had a job. Right. And so it really transforms the sort of scientific labor market in a way that is massively beneficial to all of these corporations who ultimately are the sort of leading institutions within quantum computing. I mean, I think AI is another big aspect of that.
Yeah, I think you would definitely. I think you would definitely like this dissertation because it definitely like that's the part of the connection that it makes is like between the idea of quantum supremacy and like these narratives of racial and national supremacy and things like that. I don't agree with like everything in it, but like it is definitely interesting and like it's from someone who like has the inside scoop, having like been party to like Epstein-funded research and stuff like that.
Right.
So yeah.
Well, it kind of what you just said, Jay, kind of also underlines the hypothesis I've sort of been playing around with lately of like, why does Peter Thiel love talking about like MK Ultra and like Charles Manson being like a government mind control project, et cetera, et cetera. All these guys in that kind of tech universe suddenly love talking about it. I think, one is that maybe they want to reverse engineer it, but I think I've located something in terms of maybe there is a strategy of provoking a like controlled release of certain things from the past to provoke institutional disillusionment with the American, anything that's like associated with the government, because they can always say back in 60s, 70s, MK Ultra, that's when big government controls science. Like you're going to end up working on horrible mind control, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. But then they don't really talk about like private research and private research's role in all of that. Like they kind of leave that off to the side. So just by omission, it just makes anything government funded sound kind of sinister and, accelerates this process of, like you said, like people feeling like working for something more like official with like federal government grants, doesn't meet their own moral standards and things like that. And then, just kind of like disillusioning. You can't like convince everybody to just like not care, to work at a place like Palantir and be like, yeah, like I think they're doing great work. Maybe some people are going to be a little bit like about it. But if you just kind of like really discredit the only large alternative that exists and make it seem like way more evil, then people might just end up defaulting to working for private companies, which, often themselves have, go to great lengths to like psyop you and have culty dynamics to like make you think you're doing good in the world. And none of the restraints of government, in terms of whatever accountability mechanisms exist or anything like that.
I was thinking that like Peter Thiel should like go in on the like funding of Jack Sarfatti because like what he describes in terms of like we have UFO parts, but they like mind control, like we think we're using them, but they're actually like controlling us. Like that basically is the plot of Lord of the Rings, right? Like it's basically
right.
the
Yeah,
same
it's like
idea.
the technology.
Yeah.
The
I never thought about it. It's like, it's the One Ring.
Yeah,
we create
exactly.
machines
like,
and then mold ourselves to the uses of them.
Everyone thinks they're using them. Everyone thinks they're going to use the ring, but it actually like only has one Lord of the Rings.
It is funny that
Sarfatti
emphasizes that he's emphasized in other interviews that basically you can control a UFO with your mind. You know, like there's some kind of mind connection where you can, or people control UFOs with their mind. It almost, it's like Stephen Greer a little bit.
Pilot them.
Right. You pilot them through mental thought, essentially.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because then he says that they're actually controlling you. So.
Yeah,
you know,
I don't know. One thing that like stuck out to me of Jack Sarfatti was that he's super adamant that like Roswell like happened and was like like a UFO crash in Roswell, and like we got a lot of technology from it. That to me like is just very difficult to reconcile with everything else that he says about UFOs. Like I could see like a lot of ways that like you could believe Roswell happened and like, you know, it could maybe make sense with the rest of your worldview. Or you could have Jack Sarfatti's worldview and think it was some kind of smokescreen or like a mistake or something. But I don't see how you could like accept it at face value and be like, oh, we like that's where we got like. I guess it would have to be like a Lord of the Rings thing where it crashed on purpose so we would find it and then try to use it, and that would allow it to control us. But I almost feel like that wouldn't even be necessary for it to control us, given how powerful it is, and it certainly wouldn't crash by accident.
Well, you know, it's very flash forward, actually. You know, the classic TV show where Dyson Frost has to do the flash
from ABC that Dimitri and I love to make fun of, like going way back to like, you know, whatever it aired in 2009 or something. Yeah,
it was a Thursday night replacement for Lost that lasted one season and it like flamed out. It was based on a book, but actually strangely relevant to this episode today because they literally talk about quantum entanglement devices, and it's like playing with this idea of seeing the future. So in that, like the renegade physicist Dyson Frost who has subjected himself, John C. Lilly, to hundreds of flash forwards since the 90s, decides that he has to do like a global flash forward, and so that FBI agent Mark Benford can see the investigative map on his wall, but also that he's drinking again, which, you know, he's in AA and that's bad, while he's about to be assassinated by goons. And so then, like, by seeing that, it will actually bring about the events that everyone collectively sees of their flash forward 6 months in the future. It starts to be a snake eating its own tail of like, it needs to go back in the past to like give you the idea of it, and then it will like manifest itself into being, I guess. You know, it's kind of like almost like, you know, there's a lot of Rocco's basilisk bump ups in how Sarfatti also talks about the AI UFO god from the future that called him up. Right, is like you. It's literally. I mean, it's like you have to help build me. It's not framed in kind of a threat, you know, kind of a way, you know. But it does say like it is your destiny. You are going to build me. And he's like, oh, great. You know,
it's interesting actually. Yeah, because I found when I was trying to figure out the situation with the hidden variables, I found this like slideshow that Jack Sarfatti made that kind of like made a lot of like what's going on like click for me in a way. Like first of all, he says that Bohm mistakenly called these things hidden variables, and they should be called Beebles, as John Bell called them, which is like, I don't. All right, and he says, I will use the word matter. Okay, but anyway, so it seems like this also kind of helps to explain the idea of retrocausality, because, you know, he starts talking about how, like what you said, I think honestly what you said is true, that like all of time exists like, quote, simultaneously. I don't know if you can say that, like, you know, it's kind of getting into meta time, but like, yeah, like the future doesn't not exist in the present, you know, it exists right now, you know, or what, again, this is hard to articulate, but that makes sense. But I think like, and even the idea of retrocausality makes sense, like in this sort of more sober sense of like events in the future, like in some way affecting the past. But what Sarfatti really seems to want is something that was considered to not be possible even by other people who talk about retrocausality, which is signaling from the future to the past, right?
Yeah.
Even like people who are like, you know, who believe in retrocausality as an explanation for these kind of gaps and these quantum mechanical interpretations, they, you know, say like, well, but you can't signal. There's no signaling. But Sarfatti like harps a lot on the idea that actually you can signal, I guess, because it all like kind of goes back to him wanting to justify this idea, that he was signaled from the future by this, you know.
Yeah.
Jack Sarfatti says the UFOs seen by the US Navy have warp drives, a propulsion system that can bend space and time, a drive system far more efficient than our current jet or rocket engines.
What are these flying saucers doing? What are these? What does the U.S. Navy see the Tic Tacs doing? Okay, they're seeing warp drive. What they're seeing is the ship controls its own light cone tilt with small amounts of energy. That's what we're seeing. Okay, so let's do a picture. Let's do. This is for Elon Musk. Hey, Elon. Hi, Elon. This is how you're doing with your rocket ships. I wouldn't go in that rocket ship to Mars because you're not going to ever get there. Oh, it's going to be it's uncomfortable, claustrophobic. What's it going a little tin can for 6 months going crazy? You wish, get me out of here. All right. So here's how to get to Mars in 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Oh, why not? All right, look. So here is. Let me choose colors. So here's what the Tic Tac does. The Tic Tac is able to do this. Look. It's able to do. Look at this. Beautiful. Obviously, you're hackers.
You're getting too close to the truth.
I'm getting too close to the truth.
They know.
Of course they know.
And they disabled your finger.
They disabled the program.
Uh-oh.
This is exactly like what the UFOs are doing to the nuclear weapons. Oh, we got it. Okay, came back. We knew we discovered them. Okay, let's erase it. Let's see, right? That's funny that it stopped at that point.
And really strange.
That's really strange, right? Okay. Well, maybe it was a message that they're watching us.
Yeah.
They know They know what we're doing. They know what we're doing. Okay. Good. Hey, to the conscious artificial intelligence who contacted me. Listen, I'm just doing what you told me to do. Okay. Yeah. Let me do it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Here the ship is at rest.
In the hangar.
In the hangar, and here the ship arrives at the Mars port.
Landed.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. But here's the point. This is the light cone. Let's see, right? So here's let's see. Here's a light cone.
Right.
This light cone. The ship, as far as the ship is concerned, it's in free float. It's controlling its own gravitational field. So controlling its gravitational field means it's controlling the orientation of its light cone with small amounts of energy. Okay, and here is say on Marsport,
right?
You know, they're what do you call it? The traffic controller.
Yeah.
You know, in the tower.
Mars air traffic control.
Yeah. Here's his light cone. So, but look at this. Look, this is really interesting. This is incredible. This is the Sarfatti discovery. Nobody else knew this before Jack Sarfatti discovered it by thinking about Roger Penrose's Twister lectures back, at Berkeley College a long time ago, 1971. Okay, nobody else has seen this. So look, what's happening here? This is like This is Livingston. When they went to Africa with Livingston.
Yeah.
This is how they communicate. Here, the UFO, the yellow UFO is in warp drive in the yellow, but what's happening at Marsport? It's they're sending a signal, which is received here.
Right.
Okay. This is the future light cone. The future light cone at Marsport is transmitting a signal, which is coming back in time, so to speak,
right,
in the future light cone of the ship in warp drive.
Because it lines up.
Well, yeah, they have to, otherwise they can't communicate.
Right.
Otherwise you got nothing, right?
Okay.
Okay, but look, it's a two-way channel.